The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $75, and Delbert Hollis let out a laugh that carried all the way to the back of the tent. It was the kind of laugh a man practices in a mirror, a laugh meant to be heard, and on that particular Saturday, the 12th of May, 1979, at the Prescott Farm dispersal auction just outside Bellwether, Missouri, everyone in the sale tent heard it. The object that had drawn the laugh sat on a low wooden pallet near the front of the row, a squat, dust-gray stone urn about the height of a bushel basket, its shoulders chipped, its base ringed with a crust of old mortar, and its lid sealed down tight with a band of lead solder that had blackened over the decades into something the color of a bruise. There was no polish on the thing, no ornament worth noting, only a faint set of initials chiseled crookedly into the belly of the stone, and a hairline crack running from the rim down to the shoulder like a long-healed scar. Elias Warner stepped forward and paid the $75 in cash, counting the bills out from a leather wallet worn soft at the corners, and he did not look up when Delbert laughed. He did not look up when the auction clerk chuckled either. He signed the receipt with a hand that had held a soldering iron and a file and a set of jeweler's picks for 51 years, and he folded the paper into his shirt pocket without a word. Elias was 68 that spring, lean as a fence rail, stooped a little at the shoulders from a lifetime of leaning over benches, and his face was the color and texture of a saddle left too long in the sun. He wore the same clothes he had worn to every auction since Truman was president, a faded blue chambray shirt buttoned to the throat, a canvas jacket the color of dry hay, and a work cap with the brim curled from being pinched between the same two fingers 10,000 times. His hands, when he set them down on the edge of the pallet to steady himself, were a map of small white scars, and the knuckles were swollen from years of holding small things very carefully. Delbert Hollis, on the other hand, was 49, ruddy in the cheeks, heavy through the middle, and dressed that day in a sport coat the color of a road flare over a knit shirt, whose collar strained against a gold chain, thick enough to tow a boat. He owned the biggest used car lot within 3 counties, a place with plastic pennants and a giant inflatable gorilla that waved in the wind, and he had come to the auction the way he came to everything, loud and certain and already tasting the story he would tell about it later. He clapped his hands together when Elias signed the receipt and turned to the crowd like a man playing to a balcony. "Look at that," he called out. "Old Warner just bought himself a rock." $75 for a rock with a lid. He shook his head and grinned around at the ring of faces. "I'll give you 80 for it right now, Warner, and you can put the extra 5 toward a haircut." The crowd laughed the way crowds do, because it is easier to laugh with the loud man than to stand quiet with the still one, and Delbert christened the urn on the spot. The Tombstone Teapot, he called it. The Prescott Pickle Jar. He tried out 3 or 4 names before one stuck, and by the time Elias had backed his old green Ford up to the pallet, half the tent was calling it the Fool's Kettle. What none of them saw, because none of them had spent their lives looking at seams and joints and the small tells of a maker's hand, was that the lead band around the lid of that urn had been laid down by someone who knew what he was doing. It was not a slop job. It was not a hasty pour. The band was even, the drip lines were controlled, and the surface had been smoothed with a hot iron while it was still warm. Whoever had sealed that urn had meant for it to stay sealed against water and air and time, and had done the work with the patience of a man saying a prayer. Elias had noticed that seam within 30 seconds of walking past the pallet, and he had noticed something else too, a small marking on the underside of the rim, half hidden by the mortar crust, that looked to his eyes like the stamp of a stonecutter he had known a very long time ago. Elias had learned his trade from a man named Orrin Petty, who ran a locksmith and small repair shop on the north end of Bellwether from 1919 until the day he laid down his file in 1953, and did not pick it back up. Orrin was a slow-spoken man with a walrus mustache and a habit of holding up a finished piece and turning it in the light before he handed it back to a customer. "A lock is a promise," Orrin used to say, "and a seal is a promise kept longer." He said other things too, things Elias had carried with him into every job he ever took. A hurried hand leaves a hurried mark. What a man seals up careful, another man ought to open careful. And the one Elias thought about most often, especially on nights when the shop was quiet and he was working alone under the yellow bench lamp. The truth of a thing is usually a quarter-inch deeper than the last man looked. If you have ever watched an old craftsman work, watched him take a thing the world has already given up on and coax it back into being, then you already understand the kind of story this is going to be, and you already understand what this channel is about. So if you have not yet, take a second to subscribe, because these are the stories we tell here, the ones about quiet people and the slow good they do when nobody is looking. The reason Elias had bid on the urn was not the initials, though he had seen them. It was not the mortar crust, though he had noted it. It was the stamp under the rim, the small crossed hammers with a P in the center, and it was the seam of lead solder that had been laid down with the same patience Orrin Petty had once laid down a seam on a strongbox for the bank in Fulton in 1936. Elias had helped him on that job as an apprentice, holding the iron steady while Orrin worked the lead, and he had never forgotten the look of a Petty seal. He had not seen one in 30 years. And here was one, sitting on a pallet at a farm auction, being called a pickle jar by a man in a red coat. They loaded the urn onto the bed of the Ford with the help of 2 younger men from the auction crew, and it took all 3 of them and a good deal of grunting to set it down easy on the folded quilt Elias had brought for that purpose. The stone was heavier than it looked, heavy in a way that suggested the inside was not empty. Delbert stood watching with his thumbs hooked in his belt, and as Elias climbed into the cab, he called out one more time, "Drive careful, Warner. You don't want to spill the pickles." And the crowd laughed again, and Elias closed the door of the Ford and drove out of the field at 15 miles an hour, with the urn riding steady behind him and the dust rising slow off the gravel road in the late afternoon light. There is a kind of patience that looks like weakness, right up until the moment it doesn't, and Elias had spent most of his life inside that particular sentence. He drove the 11 miles home the long way, avoiding the potholes he knew by heart, and when he reached his little clapboard house at the end of Sycamore Lane, he backed the truck up to the doors of the shop he had built out of an old smokehouse in 1961. He did not unload the urn that night. He sat on the porch instead, ate a cold supper of ham and buttered bread, and watched the light go blue over the sycamores. He thought about Orrin Petty, and about the crossed hammer stamp, and about a name he had not spoken aloud in a very long time. Word of the purchase reached town before Elias did. That is how small towns work, and it has always been so. By Sunday morning, the men at the counter of the Bellwether Diner were already trading versions of the story, and by Monday the Fool's Kettle was being discussed at the feed store, and the barber shop and the parts counter at the Ford dealer where Delbert Hollis made a point of stopping in to retell the tale himself, complete with an impression of Elias counting out the $75 one bill at a time. "Old Warner has finally lost his marbles," Delbert said, and by Tuesday evening even the school children were saying it. Harlan Beams, who had known Elias since the 2 of them were boys running trot lines on the Gasconade, drove out to Sycamore Lane on Wednesday afternoon with a jar of his wife's preserves as an excuse and a question in his eye. He found Elias in the shop, sitting on a stool with the urn between his knees, running the pad of his thumb along the lead seam the way a man reads Braille. Harlan set the jar of preserves on the bench and cleared his throat. "Del Hollis is telling everybody you paid $75 for a rock," he said. Elias did not look up from the seam. "It'll open," he said. Harlan waited a while for something more, and when nothing came, he nodded once and let himself out. That was the whole of the conversation. Harlan Beams read price tags, and Elias Warner read seals, and that was the whole distance between them. If you have made it this far into the story, if the shape of Elias Warner is starting to feel familiar to you, like someone you knew, or someone you wish you had known, then go ahead and hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you, the part where the urn gives up its secret, and the town of Bellwether learns what a petty seal really means. The initials chiseled crooked into the belly of the stone were JPC, and they belonged to a man named Josiah Prescott Calder, who had once owned a modest limestone quarry 3 miles north of town, and a reputation that, at the time of his death in the winter of 1948, had been broken as clean as a dry stick. Josiah Calder had been a careful man, a church-going man, a man who paid his workers in cash on Friday afternoons and kept his ledgers in a hand so neat it looked printed. He had also been accused, in the last year of his life, of stealing $16,000 from the account of a partnership he had entered into with a man named Vernon Prescott, a distant cousin who owned the farm where the auction had been held. The accusation had come suddenly, in the form of a set of ledger pages Vernon produced at the county courthouse, pages that showed withdrawals in Josiah's hand, which Josiah swore he had never made. There was no trial, because Josiah died of a heart attack 3 days after the pages were entered into evidence, collapsing in the yard behind his own quarry office in a snowfall so heavy the men who found him had to brush the flakes off his face to be sure who he was. The debt was settled out of his estate. His name went dark in the county. His widow, Ruth Calder, moved to a small house on the west edge of town and took in mending to survive, and their daughter Alma, who had been 19 when her father died, never spoke his name in public again. Ruth Calder had passed in 1971. Alma, unmarried, still living in the little house on the west edge, was 50 years old that spring of 1979 and worked as a bookkeeper at the co-op. She was a tired-looking woman with her mother's straight back and her father's careful hands, and she had long since stopped expecting the world to remember her father as anything other than the man who had stolen from Vernon Prescott. The urn had sat, all those years, in the corner of Vernon Prescott's parlor, and then in his attic after his second wife decided she did not care for it, and finally in the barn where the auction crew had found it under a tarp when they were clearing the estate. Nobody in the Prescott family had known what it was, or why Josiah's initials were on it, or why the lid had been sealed with lead. Nobody had thought to ask. It was a heavy, ugly stone jar, and it had gone on the pallet with the churns and the crocks and the broken hay rakes. Elias worked on the urn for 6 evenings. He did not hurry. He set up a small work light over his bench, and he studied the seal from every angle before he laid a single tool against it. On the first evening, he cleaned the mortar crust off the shoulder with a soft brass brush, working in small circles, stopping every few minutes to blow the dust away and look. On the second evening, he warmed a thin blade over the alcohol burner and slid it, a 1/4 inch at a time, along the outer edge of the lead band, softening the solder just enough to loosen its grip on the stone without cutting into it. On the third evening, he did the same on the inside edge of the rim, working by feel more than sight, his tongue caught between his teeth the way it had been when he was 17, and Orrin Petty was watching him from across the bench. On the fourth evening, he went slower still, because the seal had begun to give, and a seal that has held for 30 years does not want to be rushed in its last hour. On the fifth evening, he stopped early. He set the tools down, wiped the urn with a clean rag, and sat looking at it in the yellow light until the moths came in through the crack in the shop door. Some things, Orrin had told him once, deserve a night of rest before you finish them. On the 6th evening, which was a Thursday, and which was cool and smelled of cut grass and coming rain, Elias eased the lid off the urn. It came free with a sound like a held breath, finally letting go, a small dry sigh of air moving between two surfaces that had not been apart in a very long time, and he set the lid on a folded towel beside the bench and did not immediately look inside. He wiped his hands on his trousers. He took off his cap and set it on the bench too. Then he leaned forward and looked. Inside the urn, wrapped in a square of oilcloth that had been folded 4 times and tied with waxed string, was a bundle. Beneath the bundle, wedged carefully against the inner walls to keep it from shifting, was a canvas sack the size of a loaf of bread, heavy in a way that made Elias set it down on the bench with both hands. And tucked into the neck of the sack, held there by the drawstring, was a single envelope of yellowed paper with 3 words written across the front in a careful, printed hand. To whoever opens this. Elias untied the waxed string on the oilcloth bundle first. Inside were ledger pages, the original ones, in Josiah Calder's handwriting, along with a set of matching pages in a different hand, a hand that leaned the other way and pressed too hard on the downstrokes, and a signed and notarized statement from a man named Emmett Doyle, who had been Vernon Prescott's bookkeeper in the spring of 1948, in which Emmett Doyle confessed, in plain and unhurried sentences, that he had been paid $300 by Vernon Prescott to forge the ledger pages that ruined Josiah Calder's name. The statement was dated the 9th of November, 1948, 6 weeks before Josiah died. It was witnessed by two men whose signatures Elias recognized from other papers he had seen over the years, both of them dead now, both of them respected in their time. The canvas sack held $16,200 in old bills, banded and dated in Josiah's hand, the exact amount he had been accused of stealing plus $200, which a small note pinned to the top band explained was intended to cover the cost of clearing his name in the county paper. The letter, when Elias unfolded it, was written on the same yellowed paper as the envelope, in the same careful printed hand. It read, "To whoever opens this, my name is Josiah Prescott Calder, and if you are reading these words, I am past the reach of harm, and past the reach of help. I did not take what Vernon says I took. The proof of that is in this urn, along with the money he claims I stole, which I have set aside from my own savings, so that my Ruth and my Alma will not be asked to pay a debt that was never mine. I have sealed this urn because I do not trust the courts of this county while Vernon still has friends in them, and I do not trust my own heart to hold out long enough to see this through. If you are a stranger, I ask only that you take these papers to my daughter Alma, and that you place the money where it will do her and her mother the most good. If you are a friend, I ask the same, and I thank you. A man's name is the one thing he cannot mend for himself once he is gone. I am trusting you to mend mine." Signed, Josiah P. Calder, the 14th of December, 1948. Elias read the letter twice, then he folded it back along its creases, laid it on the bench beside the ledger pages, and sat for a long time with his hands flat on his knees, looking at nothing in particular. He could have kept the money. He could have burned the letter and the ledger pages and the confession, and taken the $16,200 and no one would ever have known. Vernon Prescott was 15 years in the ground. Emmett Doyle was 12. The two witnesses were gone. The urn had been called a pickle jar in front of 100 people, and if Elias had said nothing more about it, the world would have gone on calling him a fool and thinking nothing else. He sat with that thought for perhaps 5 minutes. Then he stood up, put his cap back on, wrapped the letter and the papers in the oilcloth, retied the canvas sack, and carried the whole of it out to the Ford. He drove to Alma Calder's house on the west edge of town at a little after 9 on a Thursday night. She answered the door in a housecoat with a dish towel in her hand, and when she saw who it was, she looked puzzled, because Elias Warner had never once in her life come to her door. He took off his cap. "Miss Calder," he said, "I have something that belongs to you." He set the bundle on her kitchen table and told her, in as few words as he knew how, what was inside it and where it had come from. He did not sit down. He did not accept the coffee she tried, twice, to press on him. When she began to cry, quietly, with one hand pressed flat against the ledger pages as if to make sure they were real, he looked away out the dark window and waited until she had gathered herself. Then he put his cap back on and told her the papers ought to go to Sheriff Boyd in the morning, and that a lawyer named Halloran in Fulton would know what to do with the rest. He was out the door before she could properly thank him, and he drove home the long way, past the quarry road, with the window down and the smell of coming rain in the cab. The papers went to Sheriff Boyd on Friday morning. The story broke in the county paper the following Wednesday, and it broke in a way that could not be argued with, because Emmett Doyle's confession was in his own hand, and the forged ledger pages sat beside the true ones on the front page of the paper for anyone to compare. The Calder name was cleared in a single afternoon of reading. A small correction was printed, 31 years too late, in the same column of the same paper that had first carried the accusation. Alma Calder used a portion of the money to buy back her father's headstone from the Potter's Field corner of the cemetery, where it had been moved in 1949, and to have him reinterred beside her mother under a new stone that carried, beneath his name, the words, "A good man wronged, now remembered." Delbert Hollis said very little in the weeks that followed. He stopped telling the story of the pickle jar at the Ford counter, and after a while people stopped asking him to. His car lot began to lose ground that summer to a new dealership out by the highway, and within 3 years the inflatable gorilla was gone, and the plastic pennants had been taken down, and by the spring of 1983, Delbert had sold what was left of the lot and moved south to a place near Hot Springs, where nobody had ever heard of a stone urn or a lead seal or an old man in a chambray shirt. The urn itself was given, at Alma Calder's request, to the Bellwether Historical Society, and it was set on a low pedestal in the front room of the little museum on Main Street, with a brass plaque beneath it that told the story in 6 careful sentences and ended with the words sealed by Josiah P. Calder, opened by Elias Warner, 1979. Elias walked down to look at it exactly once, on a Sunday evening in October when the museum was closed and the street was empty, and he stood on the sidewalk with his hands in the pockets of his canvas jacket and looked at the urn through the front window for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he turned around and walked back to the Ford and drove home to Sycamore Lane, where the porch light was on and the shop was waiting, and there was a small clock on the bench that a widow from 3 counties over had asked him to look at, because she had heard, from somebody who had heard from somebody else, that Elias Warner was the kind of man who could open what other people had given up on. So I will leave it with you. If you had been the one to lift that lid on a Thursday night in a quiet shop with no witnesses, and if you had counted out $16,200 on your workbench in a town that had spent a week calling you a fool, would you have carried it across town to a tired woman in a housecoat? Or would you have folded it into your pocket and let a dead man stay buried under a name that was never his?